The Civic Journey programme is a 2-year transformational programme that blends research, evidence, participatory work and engagement with young people across the UK, across all 4 devolved nations, and reaching as far as possible into different rural and urban and different communities across the UK, and then culminating in a social action phase where we're looking to pilot and test new approaches. And all of this is focused on how can we better understand and better support the journey that young people go through in order to become what we have often called in the past active citizens. But we're taking a very critical approach to that, in which acknowledges that for a lot of young people, they don't feel that they need to become an active citizen. They already are an active citizen, and we're respecting that and we're appreciating that in full. But we're also being very critical and looking through the eyes of young people at some of the challenges that they see in terms of being able to engage in different forms of what we've sometimes called democratic participation. So that could be voting, it could be different forms of campaigning or civic engagement. Sometimes it's just described as getting your voice heard on issues that matter to you, but also how they can take part in other approaches to which we would have under the umbrella of the civic journey. This can include volunteering, it can involve forms of social action. We're also very interested in civic literacy, how young people understand their role as a citizen and understand the structures and systems they need to work with in order to create change. So we see all of those as themes under the civic journey, but what we're most interested in is those key transitions that young people go through and how we can better support. We're calling it scaffold. This is a term that Matthew Flinders has primarily developed. How can we scaffold those opportunities better so that young people aren't constantly, for example, having a one-off experience and then finding that they slip through the cracks, or that they move to another life transition and it's really hard to keep their momentum around different types of being civic. We have got a couple of quick slides for you just to help you visualize the journey. So Samantha, you don't mind quickly sharing that, thank you. If we can just move to the first slide. And on to the next one, thank you. So it's a primarily youth-led and co-produced programme. We've, over the first year, and we're at 1 year into the project, or a little bit further in, we've conducted a mixed method research project, which has used methods including participatory filmmaking with young people in different local communities. We've used peer research, which is an approach where we train young people as researchers and then they interview and they engage their peers, which enables us to reach into different spaces and to different groups of young people that perhaps wouldn't respond if you just put out a call saying, would you like to be part of a research project? And we've also used digital methods, so digital workshops and creative methods, all intended to actually look at in depth at what is the civic journey? How can we understand it through the voice of young people? How can we understand the aspirations that people have for their active citizenship and for the change they want to see in society? And then finally, what support do they need to have a stronger, more consistent civic journey? And we're building that currently into a youth agenda, which is looking at through what approaches and types of participation and on what issues do young people want to create change or take action. Alongside that, working with Professor Matthew Flinders and Dr. Andy Mycott, we've been developing an evidence base, and that's really our respect to the huge track record of work that's already been done by people like yourselves in this space and all the research that's come before. And we've been building an evidence base focused on what works to support young people's civic journey. And I suppose our key contribution to that is seeing it as an end-to-end life journey that starts around the age of 4 when young people go to school. And obviously, your start in life is mitigated by spatial inequalities, perhaps advantages or disadvantages according to how you're born or where you're born. And then basically looking all the way through primary to secondary school to transitions into work or apprenticeship or into university, and then on into the workplace or into different forms of young people's engagement in community. And so we're looking between the ages of 4 and 30 in the broader project, but this particular part of the project is focusing more on those early to later teenage years and up to the age of 30 in particular. But we recognise there's a huge amount to do to draw together the evidence of what schemes, what programmes, what approaches within school, outside of school, in charities, in local communities, and run as residentials as well, have really worked or not worked, in what ways in this space. We can just move to the next slide, which is my final slide for this section. So this is a journey map, and this is where we've looked at mapping sort of the typical civic journey. And I won't read out everything that's here, but this picks up on some of our emerging findings that we had gathered together from our analysis, working with over 2,600 young people in the first year of the project. And what you can see is this is mapping out the key kind of states and stages and transitions, basically, that we've been working on and understanding, partly through the work with our youth advisory board, and I know we've got one of them here today. What are some of the typical moments where people struggle and fall down in transitions, and what are the moments sometimes that actually spark their involvement or sustain their involvement? And we've tried to describe this through the way and the words that we used in our research findings. So, for example, you've got the spark moment, which you can see on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. That's a moment where young people really suddenly had a moment of wanting to be engaged. It was an entry point into civic engagement, so to speak. You've got, for example, ebbs and flows, which might work around the structures and the challenges and the, financial, social, economic, environmental barriers that young people are having, where they struggle perhaps to sustain how they would like to be involved in society. And you can visualize all of this and see it in more detail in our emerging findings report, which we published before Christmas. What we've been looking at is findings against 3 key research objectives, and these were ones that were shaped sort of by thinking about, we don't just want this programme to focus on diagnosing kind of challenges within the existing civic journey that young people go through. We also want to look towards solutions and aspirations. So we're taking a very asset-based approach to looking at the civic journey with young people. So these are our 3 research objectives that we've gathered findings against so far. The first one is understanding, and this is us understanding with young people, in their words, what do concepts of citizenship, service, and we sometimes call that service learning, and societal change actually mean to young people today. And underneath that, we've been unpicking a huge amount of other definitions, including when we first ran this session with the advisory board, and Ashley may have reflections on this later in the session, the word civic was completely alien to most of the people that we were working with, and was felt to be, very, very research speak, as we sometimes say, or very policy speak. But it's really when you start unpicking what civic means, what really emerged was 2 things. One, that it was about a sense of a contribution to community. And in our first co-creation sessions with the advisory board, they really centred on that notion of contributing to your local community and just belonging and being part actively of your local community, as opposed to perhaps feeling isolated, which a lot of people, particularly young people, we know statistically have felt during the pandemic. And sometimes we know from the data that typical engagement in community tends to happen a bit later in life. So we know that normatively people become more engaged with their communities around the age of 35, particularly place-based communities, and then that grows in significance up until around the age of 70. So this was a very interesting point to pivot the notion of being civic to being focused more about community. And of course, some of the findings that highlights is the need to think about that other research objective around support. So then if we're thinking about civic engagement and active citizenship, starting really from young people's sense of belonging in their local communities, then it makes sense that we think about what forms of support or provision, learning opportunities, mentorship, mobility, between places, or what we talk about sometimes in terms of social mobility, and other forms of scheme or volunteering. What can be actually delivered within local communities and local settings in order to reach young people where they first are telling us that they're starting to become civically engaged. Aspiration, I just want to highlight this. So this was how we were understanding how young people would like to embody and make real how they understand citizenship and societal change. So what are their aspirations? What issues do they really care about and want to work on? And how do they want to do it? And we were trying to really engage with youth-led approaches, and not just through formal or informal forms of civic participation that might have been dominant in the past. So if we just move to the next slide, please. And these are just a few highlights of what we've found, and these you'll see become some of the themes that we're looking at later on in the session. So, for example, we understand that young people feel we need to better connect civic learning and engagement, and that's about, sort of we've heard a lot about how demotivating in some cases, or sometimes just sporadic, civic learning opportunities were in schools. And that's not to say any negative reflection on schools. It's just that it has been deprioritized in terms of resourcing of this kind of agenda. And as a result, it's sometimes an agenda that isn't, universally taught. And it's also something that schools struggle to maintain a consistent offer in. So we heard a lot about young people remembering a bit about their civic education or citizenship education in schools, but thinking actually about how can we develop civic learning opportunities that perhaps are better connected to the local community, or better connect to the themes and issues that young people are telling us really matter to them, in order to then for those to have more meaning or more lasting impact when young people are in formal and informal educational settings. We can just move to the next slide. So the next big finding that we looked at, and this was a hypothesis of the project, that we felt we needed to understand those transitions and between key moments, and I highlighted a few at the start, so between primary to secondary school, also moving into post 16, so apprenticeship, and then into perhaps into the workplace for some young people. Obviously post 18, potentially some going to university or further education, but also a lot going straight into the world of work, or taking time to think about maybe a social enterprise that they want to develop, or their own kind of self-directed learning. And then thinking, for the post-university or post-further education years, people moving into their first jobs, and even, quite a lot of the struggles within life transitions. So, becoming independent, leaving home, we're thinking about the social relations that are also in play when people leave their families, for example, or even transition into parenthood. So we were trying to think very much in the round about this, and a really enriching findings from the project are about how do young people experience those individual transitions, and how can we scaffold support between those transitions, so that, for example, a young person that has really got into volunteering at one point in their civic journey can sustain a form of civic participation even when their life changes between another transition. Next slide, please. Another finding we really found through the voice of young people was how can we build communities of action? And this is at lots of different scales. It's not just place-based, it's also around, forms of identity and communities of identity. And so this is about how particularly can we think about building a sense of belonging and a sense of pride between young people and their local communities, and how does that become, I suppose, operationalized or made real through civic and participation in types of civic engagement. And we're looking particularly at what could new forms of building belonging, building pride within communities that are led by young people or involve young people, what could those look like? Because that was really highlighted as an area where people were really looking to see more opportunity and action. We can move to the next slide. And then finally, uniting civic space and places. So how can we better connect and integrate digital initiatives? And we did a whole suite engaging over 200 young people in online digital forms of research. A lot of this was also mapping their transitions, but thinking about how much agency did they feel they had? Where did they feel their voice was seen, heard, and powerful within particular online communities? And thinking about how do we better connect, sort of real world experiences with the digital world? How can young people develop transformative routes to creating change, or where are they doing it already? And we heard a lot of really interesting initiatives in our emerging findings document, which I see Helen's kindly put in the chat. And you can have a look at what young people, where they were specifically taking action and how, as part of that document. But I hope that's given you a brief flavour of the findings. There's so much more that's available in the emerging findings document, and we will also, largely led by Andy, Matt and Jessica Redmond, who's another member of our team who's not here today. We will be publishing a longer report looking particularly at those transitions and the findings of how young people understand, aspire to and need support around their civic engagement. We'll be aiming to do that in the early spring. So thank you so much, and I hope I haven't taken too much of your time. Thank you.
So the Civic Journey call to action. What is this call to action about? you know now, I think that, I mean, collectively in this room and more broadly, but particularly within the Civic Journey team, we want to understand how to improve support for young people during that journey, and indeed making it a lifelong journey. So what we want to do is research, I think practice, innovation, activities often outpace research. Sometimes they're very helpfully combined together. But we want to fund a series of projects and prototypes that focus on and to respond to some of those themes that Emily described earlier. We're wanting to pilot approaches to the civic journey that show how it can be continued, particularly through changing circumstances that might be changing through time or interests, and connect to the aspirations of children and young people as they transition from childhood to early adulthood. I think, yeah, just on that point, I think we will try to hold the frame of it's a lifelong journey while we're actually specifically focused on some of the transitions in early life. I think will be something attention will have to navigate. But I think for this, we're really quite talking about younger people. So I'll just do a quick reprise of those learnings and findings earlier. So the first area of interest is connecting civic learning and engagement. How can we better integrate initiatives and opportunities for learning engagement in schools, colleges, communities, online through the transitions between primary, secondary, and further education? And then further, how do you better support young people who undertake really quite complex life transitions to continue or spark an interest in their learning and participation, moving into further education, into employment, indeed into unemployment, whether they're leaving home or care or becoming parents themselves? Another theme of interest is building communities of action. So how can we ensure that all children and young people are provided with opportunities to build a real sense of belonging to and pride in their communities, whether that's through formal or informal volunteering, social action, participation, and seeing engagement and citizenship in the civic journey as very broad, a broad set of activities you can become engaged in your communities. And uniting civic spaces and places. So how can we better integrate real world and digital online initiatives? We spoke in one of our breakout groups about the connections between the trans community and online and offline. I think there's something really interesting there. And how do we develop understanding of the drivers of citizen engagement? So those significant either personal or political or societal events or issues that really kickstart and resonate strongly with young people as they grow up and how to take and their lives sort of move on. So we are not proposing a particularly onerous application process or a particularly onerous funding criteria, but we really are interested in funding projects which meet some of the gaps or areas of interest that have been set out in the research. So understanding the central question would be, how does your project answer some questions or address some of the areas of interest that have been recently uncovered through the Civic Journey project, and which you will internally know yourself already. The depth of which the project involves young people, either in design or delivery. So we know that it's very likely that more organisations than young people themselves will apply to this funding call, but we still want to see a strong component of either being youth-led or youth-involving, and certainly responding to what young people want in your area of project. The third, which is always a bit slippery, but I think it's interesting, like, is this something distinctive? Is this now innovation or being completely unique is very, very hard. Something might have been done somewhere else that is completely new in a different context or a different place. But looking for something of how does that project stand out, where you go, oh, that's genuinely distinctive, or that looks interesting, or oh, that's an angle that we haven't thought of before, maybe. These are short prototypes and projects. So what we really want to do is a sort of quick sprint between May and September. That gives us some pros and some cons in terms of being over the summer period, but that's the time frame that we're working to. And we have a very sort of pragmatic expectation about what can be achieved during that time. And that the project demonstrating something that has the potential for replicability. So I think from certainly the Institute for Community Studies perspective, what we'd like to be doing at the end of this is looking at a portfolio of really interesting prototypes that we can then find pathways and sort of share with a much broader interest and say, look, there's some really interesting things going on here. How could we replicate that? Or how could we sustain it? Or how could we give it a national platform in terms of doing something really interesting and different that's of wider relevance to the whole sector? So those are our funding criteria and selection. at the end of, sorry, I should say what's on offer. So yes, these are small projects, so you can apply for funding for up to £15,000 per project. We'll support brokering of partnerships and collaborations where you desire them. We'll offer our advice on project design or prototyping or any sort of ad hoc needs as you need it and if you need it, either through the application or after the process when you're sort of live in the world. And this is not a research project per se, but it has a very strong research component. So we really want to be actively exploring what you're learning through that process. And so you should be willing to participate in 2 fairly short working workshops over the course of the project in June and September. So what now? So you've joined this session today, which is great. And after this, we'll be sending through an application form so you can have a look at. As I say, it's not particularly onerous. And there is an additional drop-in session if you wish to discuss your application. And we will take questions at the end of this session and also at any other time, quite frankly, that you want to get in touch to submit your idea by the 11th of April. We're not expecting very huge amounts of applications. We expect to see a fairly decent number of very strong ideas. And so we aim to get through the sifting and selection of those and be able to talk to people at the 17th of April. And there's a contact, a generic contact there that you should use for any questions and queries, although you also have my email address as well. I don't mind fielding opportunities or questions or queries through that address